In the 6th century, the Middle East was essentially a geopolitical duopoly. The map was entirely controlled by two massive superpowers, the Byzantine Empire in the west and the Sasanian Persian Empire in the east. The Sasanians projected their power through sheer military mass. They fielded massive corps of war elephants and heavily armored cavalry known as cataphracts, knights covered head to toe in chainmail and scale armor, exactly as depicted in this stone relief at Takebostan. At the top of this empire sat the Shan Shah, or King of Kings. This silver plate illustrates his semi-divine status. The opulence of the court was so extreme that royal crowns were often too heavy to be worn. They had to be suspended over the throne by golden chains. This display of wealth and armor suggests a state that was completely invincible. Yet within a few decades, this massive power would be entirely erased from the map by a newly united, primarily nomadic force. Empires rarely fall simply from losing a battle on a field. They collapse because their internal structures become brittle. Beneath the gold leaf and the heavy cavalry, the Sasanian Empire was a violently unequal society, one that was ready to shatter at the first sign of real stress. The Sasanian state, backed by the Zoroastrian priesthood, designed society as a rigid four-tier caste system. At the top of this social pyramid sat the priests and the warriors. These upper echelons lived in luxury. As seen on this silver plate, the nobility spent their time engaged in elaborate hunting expeditions, which were followed by courtly feasts featuring exotic meats and imported wines. To pay for those feasts and the endless border wars, the state aggressively squeezed the third tier of society, the farmers. Agricultural workers were locked into their estates and heavily taxed, with wealth flowing strictly upward. The state reserved its deepest suspicion for the fourth estate. Merchants and artisans were kept at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. The religious texts of the time actively discouraged commerce, viewing it as a lowly, untrustworthy pursuit. To keep these lower classes in line, the state enforced brutal social controls. Citizens who violated strict religious purity laws were subjected to public flogging, mutilation, and physical branding to permanently identify them as deviants. This system also alienated large populations of Christians, Jews, and Manichaeans. Living under forced Zoroastrian orthodoxy, these minorities found their social mobility and basic rights strictly limited by the central authority. This obsessive need to categorize and control wealth hollowed the empire out from the inside. The Sasanian state became an incredibly stiff structure. It lost the capacity to bend, leaving it vulnerable to breaking under the slightest pressure. That breaking point arrived in the form of two massive, simultaneous external shocks. The first was the Plague of Justinian. This map tracks the devastation of the bubonic plague as it swept through the densely packed cities of the Middle East, while the line chart shows the immediate economic fallout. Urban populations vanished. With the workforce decimated, Sasanian agricultural output plummeted and tax revenues cratered. While still reeling from demographic collapse, the Sasanian leadership initiated a 26-year conflict against the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, known as the Final Great War. Over 2 decades of constant sieges exhausted both militaries. The prolonged fighting emptied state treasuries and burned the vital agricultural lands of Mesopotamia and Syria down to barren ash. In the middle of this chaos, the Sasanian leadership made a fatal strategic blunder. They suddenly abolished the Lakhmids, a local Arab kingdom that had long served as a loyal allied buffer state. Removing the Lakhmids stripped away the empire's primary layer of defense to the south. It left the western desert borders completely exposed to outside raids at the exact moment the central army was starved of resources. Plague and empty treasuries and a broken border were compounding variables. The rigid Sasanian shell had reached its structural limit and was now actively fracturing under the mounting pressure. By the 630s, the imperial capital at Ctesiphon, whose ruined arch, the Tok Khazra you can see here, was in total freefall. The military was depleted, the population was starving, and the monarchy was paralyzed by violent succession crises. This total systemic failure across both the Sasanian and Byzantine empires created a wide-reaching geopolitical power vacuum across the Middle East. Stepping rapidly into that void were the Arab tribes, newly organized under the banner of Islam. The rapid expansion of the 630s functioned as a massive societal release valve. For the oppressed subjects of the old empires, the arrival of a new authority represented a rare path toward stability. Islam was founded by a merchant prophet, making its ideology highly commerce-friendly. This was an attractive proposition to the Sasanian artisan and merchant classes, who had been systematically despised by their own state, as well as to farmers desperate for tax relief. The new system offered a cohesive social structure and predictable tax incentives. For alienated religious minorities, trading the heavy hand of Zoroastrian Orthodoxy for a new administrative framework was a logical alternative. The rise of Islam capitalized on a total systemic failure. An empire that oppresses its own foundation to maintain a rigid hierarchy is an empire preparing the stage for its success.